Well, why don't we talk about Arthur D. Little in general? You became president of the firm in the 1960s, is that correct? Or perhaps the 70s?
It was in the early 70s, and then I became chairman later.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did the firm evolve? Of course, it became one of the big players in management consulting, but it retained its research and engineering focus as well.
Right.
Maybe you could talk about Arthur D. Little in general, if that's not too vague of a question.
Well, how to talk about the company? First of all, we had fun. And secondly, we were proud of our ethical standards. And we were not a big money maker, but we did do really interesting and useful work by the ability we had to bring together teams of people. And we worked hard to foster that. As time went on, I suppose at one stage I characterized our market reach as how far a person could travel in one day. When I first joined the company, that meant somewhere like Chicago, St. Louis, Washington. And of course, today it means Singapore. So our reach across the globe expanded enormously in that period of the 60s and 70s and early 80s while I was involved. We had our first office outside the United States, I think was in Mexico City.
When did that start about?
Oh, I think it must have been in the late 50s, perhaps. I'm not sure. We opened an office in Europe in the late 50s, around 59, because it was a period when a lot of American companies were looking to expand into Europe, and they wanted information about markets and business opportunities and competitors and acquisition possibilities. And the operations research group opened its first office in London it must have been well, it was probably about 1959, 1960. It was a curious experience because it was sort of a reflection on how the company managed itself. We decided to run. We used to like to run seminars on subjects in the group for clients, and we decided somebody wanted to try one in London. So we did. And as a consequence, we ended up with a couple of assignments for British companies. And we decided that this was fun. So the next thing we knew, we rented an office. And we had a couple of people working there full time. The company didn't even know we'd opened an office in London. And, anyway, that was sort of the beginning of our European activity, Zurich and London. And over the course of time, that expanded. We opened an office, kind of a complementary office in Brussels, Frankfurt. It was in the late 60s. We opened an office in Athens, really to service the work we were doing, quite a bit of work in the Middle East. We had built quite an active telecommunications practice, which was working among other places in Saudi Arabia. And we had some large economic development projects in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and Abu Dhabi. I'm trying to think. We were working in India. We opened an office in Singapore. And this was all in the probably late 60s, early 70s. So that geographic expansion was a major element in the change of the company during that period into the 70s, early 80s.
One of the things I'd like to talk about is the people who are coming into the company. I mean, you've mentioned economic projects, so presumably there were more economists, but you also mentioned that it was a while before you actually started bringing in people from OR programs from the universities who are trained in the subject.
Well, you know, in part because it took a while for those programs to begin to produce people. But we did have people, as I mentioned, from the MIT program who worked with us in some cases part-time and some cases full-time while they were working on their thesis, for example. We tended to find that people coming into the group from science fields like chemical engineering or physics or chemistry had a much stronger orientation toward looking, observing, experimenting than some of the people who were coming out of the formal OR programs, where they didn't do very much of that.
And I asked also about the economists. When you were expanding internationally, was that something that Arthur D. Little concentrated upon, bringing in more economists?
No, we had people we were working on industrial development programs like Puerto Rico before World War II. We had a growing staff from those days through the 50s and on. We did a lot of work on economic development during the 50s, and both at a national scale and in the urban settings. So we did work on education issues, land planning, taxation questions. We had a long-standing program in Nigeria, sponsored by AID, and this was just this work on economic development was not economist-driven. It was more pragmatic. What were the industries, what could be done to improve the economic base of the country? What industries would work? What skills were needed? What education programs were needed? How could we start to move our clients' economy forward stage by stage?
What was the firm's experiences with that? Of course, it was a very dicey time politically in the third world, of course. So I know that a lot of those programs succeeded, a lot of them failed. What was the firm's experience with it?
Well, I suppose it was mixed simply because of those circumstances. In some cases, the programs were very successful and long-standing. We did a lot of work in Saudi Arabia when the kingdom decided to use its oil revenues to try to build up a broader industrial base. And that was work that was sustained. The work in Nigeria, for example, was successful in its time, but the Nigerian political situation, I think, overwhelmed it in time. And in part because of the issues of oil revenue. The oil revenue was a potential disaster for many countries in terms of their economic and social development.